Welcome to Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. I'm Reed Price. I'm the director of the center. I'm very happy to have you here. We're going to talk gardening today with Ann Lovejoy, and we've got some questions to get us started. But first, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish people, specifically the Suquamish tribe, the people of the clear salt water, who have lived on these waters of the Salish Sea since time immemorial. And we continue to benefit from their stewardship of these lands, and we can learn and do learn from them about how to be uh, better, better inhabitants. Also, something to talk about is sponsored by Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which Fieldstone is a place that offers independent and assisted living and memory care up on Rolling Bay. They have day stay and respite care programs, and you can tour their lovely campus and have lunch on them. Just give a call to Celia or Jamie. Their number is 206 594 1010, 206 594 1010, or check out their website, fieldstonecommunities.com. We are definitely in the fall, and Anne, thank you for joining us to talk about how we kind of transition our world in the garden to the next season here.
Oh, yeah, it's time, isn't it? You can see the leaves are changing. It's obviously shifting from bloom time to downtime, which is great, actually. The little sprinkles we've been getting are going to help with the fall color too, which is kind of nice and encourage things to keep on. But boy, is it dry. I really noticed today I was planting some bulbs at the senior center and finding that it's just powder dry in a lot of places, even though we've had some rain. So that's something to be thinking about when you're planting, is if you're planting in absolutely dry soil, the plants will probably be okay because they manage to gather the soil they gather the moisture as the soil moist. Uh, I'm sorry, I'm going to turn my phone off because somebody's pinging me, and it's distracting. Okay,
Okay, where does the moisture come from?
the
Maybe the
moisture
air.
comes from dew. If we don't even get rain, there's heavy, heavy dews at this time of year, which people don't remember that. So sometimes you wake up in the morning and you think, wow, did it really rain? It maybe not. It might have been this heavy dew. And what's good about that is it's really refreshing for plants, whether, it actually gets very deep down into the soil or not. But what I was saying about planting the bulbs is like you can go ahead and plant them in a completely dry situation, and assuming that we get at least a somewhat normal winter with a fair amount of rain, they'll still come up and be fine. You don't have to go out and water them carefully. If they've already got roots starting to grow, then I usually do water them in because that gives them a little more incentive and a little help along the way, right? But the other thing to remind yourself about bulbs is when they've been in a pot and you knock them out of the pot, you can remove all the gunge, all the old used up roots and all that stuff is not really great soil anymore. So take that all away. Just take the clean bulbs. You can push off their old wrappers, you know how their skin clings to the outside like a little wrapper. Take that off and then just put the fresh bulbs down, and usually about as deep as they are big. So if they're teeny bulbs, you put them in that deep. But if they're big fat ones, you put them in that deep. And that way they don't get exposed in the top. It's not that that hurts the bulb so much, but it makes them a great target for squirrels and other critters that like to eat tulip bulbs or daffodil bulbs or all kinds of things. They may not eat the daffodils, but they sure don't mind eating the bulbs.
But
And
when
that
my
goes,
bulbs don't come up, it might be because I've left them out for as food.
well, it turns out rabbits, mice, voles, all those things often do take nibbles off the bulbs in the wintertime because that's what there is, right? So, yeah, it's just one of those precautions. I have in the past when we've had a lot of problems with squirrels digging up bulbs and replacing them with peanuts. And you can put like mesh over the top of where you plant a lot of bulbs. And I've done that in the garden with pots. It turns out that's not a bad idea either, because a number of the pots that I had stacked to dry out over the summer had been raided, and I found peanuts in place of small bulbs. So I thought, okay, next year I'm going to get not chicken wire, it's too big, but the little mesh, that finer mesh that you can bend, and you just wrap it around your bulbs and even maybe put a rubber band around it or twist of wire or something. And that will keep them from getting in there and raiding your bulbs, which it's kind of annoying, right? Like you're carefully saving them, drying them off. When I had a little greenhouse, I would put the bulbs under the bench and they could dry off and be happy down there. And they like to dry out. That's their summer baking is an important part of their dormancy period. And but they don't really like being eaten. It definitely cramps their style.
So I know that Barbara showed up with a question right off the bat. And so, Barbara, do you want to share your question with us about morning glory?
Sure. We have morning glory. We, when we transplanted from a neighbor, um, uh, a, a magnolia tree, little tiny magnolia tree, and it came, and now it is all over like 5 of our 7 acres, and it's climbing over the world. We pull each year. I try to get the roots. We try burning it, and it's there in the burn pile. After it's all burned, it will re-sprout, and I didn't know if there was a way to remove it without using pesticides.
Well, yes and no. With acreage, it's harder, of course, because you got a lot of land to cover. The thing about morning glory is it it can be controlled like a lot of things like blackberries and stuff by frequent mowing will keep it down to the point where you feel like maybe it isn't really there, but the roots underground are so powerful that and they spread like crazy. And then the thing about them too is that the birds eat the seeds and spread them everywhere. We do have 2 native species of morning glories, but they're kind of delicate and rather sweet looking, and that's not usually what we got. What we usually have is the big hunky, very beautiful, but the big European morning glories with the big white flowers. Um, it is possible. The best way that I know to get rid of those roots is to bring in a lot of wood chips. And I've done that, when the tree guys are driving around the neighborhood, often they'll dump the chips if you ask them to. And I get them, dump them as much as 18 inches, 24 inches deep in areas that are really infested. Let them sit there for a couple of years or at least a few seasons. And then the ground underneath will be softened and opened up. Because part of why they're so hard to get out of the ground is because they dig down in the clay and that is like cement. You can't really just rip them out. But with a wonderful tool called the hori hori, the Japanese farmer's knife, you can actually follow those roots all the way down and get them out. They're not usually deep, deep. They're usually wide more than anything else. But it is important to keep on it. One thing that's kind of good about um, that technique is like you'll see where the sprouts are coming up through the chips. You'll see that very easily. If you pull, you'll get a certain amount, but if you pull and then scrape away the wood chips down to where you can see the soil and dig by hand, you'll be able to get a lot more of the root out. The pesticides don't really work that well on them anyway because they have thick, kind of almost waxy leaves that are a bit repellent. So honestly, the best way to get rid of them is to mow them or cut them regularly all the way, pull as much as you can and cut them every time they appear. And that is really a pretty good way to do it. But it's also, I don't know, for me, it's kind of therapeutic. I find pulling, um, when things are going in my life that I'm having a hard time with, I'll go out and battle the morning glory and feel like I'm having a worthy opponent, right? It's like sort of therapeutic. Or at tax time, you can go out and just rip as much out as you possibly can, right? So
I
it
think
has
of it as
therapeutic
job
value,
security.
right?
Yeah.
The other thing that's kind of interesting about it is that traditionally it's been used in baskets and for tying things, making almost like string, twine, things like that. Short term, of course, because once it's dried out, it's not as flexible, but it is pretty flexible. So, that's a thought. I just have found, though, staying on it is really the key to getting into the control over it. When you have acres, though, like you're talking about, can you mow or is it all in the woodlands and
No, it's in my garden. It's in my flower beds. It's climbing over the story high chicken house. It's just everywhere.
yeah,
Do pull it and it keeps coming back.
well, right. You have to get those roots, and they're tough to get all of. Um, that That said, the best techniques really are the deep mulching, like I talked about. That really does make a big difference over time because it's the only thing that will really open the soil. And without the soil being open, it's impossible to get all the roots out. And then you have your vigilance. But what I found is once I do a really big cleanup, I can do another one in the winter. And the reason for that is because in the winter, a lot of other stuff is browned off, right? And you can really see the morning glory is pretty much fresh green. It's happy and it leaps
Ah,
up, it doesn't get slowed down so much by winter. So you can see where it is and then just keep taking and taking and taking. You can put it in the green waste. I don't put it in compost because as you noticed, a lot of times, now the stems themselves don't resprout, but any bit of root will. So the stems can go in your compost if you want, but I put everything, all of it in the green waste cart because it goes to a facility where they're really taken to a high temperature and that stuff does not make it through, right? A facility of composting it goes way beyond what we can do at home. Reed, you got a question?
Yeah, well, I'm just wondering about things like places where English ivy is growing or blackberries. Is the idea of a really deep mulch a good idea there too?
It is exactly for the same reason. Somebody's got their radio on or something. A number of years ago now, I was going to say a few years ago, but realistically, it's probably more like 15. Kitsap County was doing some studies because of the ivy that was getting in all the woodlands and parks. And they found that they were mulching with wood chips, like I talked about, and found that an 18-inch layer of wood chips would kill off about 80% of the English ivy in about 3 months. And the rest was easier to pull because, like I said, the soil was opened up underneath. Now, ivy's another one that you think you got it all and you maybe did, maybe didn't, but it's also another one that's easy to spot in the winter. So when there isn't much going on in the garden and you don't want to be walking on those beds, because in the garden beds in the winter, when the soil freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, it's very, very vulnerable to compression. So if you keep walking in there and yanking on stuff in the wintertime, you're compressing your precious soil. So you stay out of the beds and instead you focus on ivy and bindweed, blackberries, and things like that that you can take with impunity, and blackberries too. So uh, the the traditional thing for blackberries is to mow or cut to the ground 3 to 5 times a year, and the timing makes a big difference. If you really watch the plant, you can do 3 times and it works. Because what you look for is when the stems first emerge and the leaves come out, and they're very soft and green, light pale green, kind of fresh looking. Those leaves are still being fed by the mother root. But when they open up and then they go flat and they turn matte, so they're not glossy anymore and they're dark colored, that's when they're becoming photosynthetic and they're pulling energy and storing it and putting it down to the mother root. So you wait for that moment so that you've depleted the mother root as much as possible, and then you whack it to the ground, right? So usually that's April or May. Second cut's going to be usually August. Third cut, usually October, November. And if you kind of cycle through like that, you will keep them because eventually the roots get depleted. And then if once you cut them as hard as you can and you put the deep mulch on top, you have the added benefit again of opening up that soil. And then you can get the roots out a lot better. But for those roots, you need a mattock, or we have these wonderful shovels called root slayers that have big fangs on the sides. You can really open the soil up with those once it's been mulched for a while, and then you can get a lot of the root out. But like with so many of these things, any little piece of root that's left in there, and there's going to always be some, is going to sprout. So these are, I think of them as my winter fitness friends because they keep me outside running around, pulling on stuff. And everybody needs a walk. If you don't have a dog, you got to have some reason to get out there and slop around, right?
thank you.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry, I don't have better news. I know everybody wants a magic pill, but there kind of isn't one.
But I have found with your advice about with the blackberries about just cutting them back, even though it's not perfect, it definitely reduces the thickness and vitality. And although there's plenty of other places for me to find those Himalayan blackberries growing if I want to eat some in the fall, in the late summer.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a big acreage, then there's an argument to be made that the blackberries can actually provide habitat. for a lot of things. I mean, everything from birds to bears would like to eat those blackberries, and birds find lots of shelter in there. But if you have a small space, that's not your friend. That's a tough plant to share with. And the good news is, the smaller the area they infest, the easier or quicker it is to get rid of them because you don't have as many plants to kind of keep on after, right? It's quite possible to get rid of them in a regular sized yard. On multiple acres, you got to mow with a brush cutter 3 to 5 times a year.
The other thing I was hoping we might talk about a little bit about is are things to plant now. I know that I'm hoping to put in some blueberries either now or in the spring. I don't know which would be better. And I want to make sure that the ground is ready, or I'm gonna mulch, but right now it's where I want to put them right now is turf. It's grass. It's our kind of messy, not really grass kind of weed stuff.
In the
So
front or the back?
in the front of my house, which so there's sun
Hmm.
and there's water because it's down. The water's they're gonna get their feet wet,
They
but
like
not all
that.
year long. Yeah.
Yeah, they do like that. So yeah, so there's arguments for and against fall or spring planting. In spring, you can usually buy bare root plants, which are a little bit cheaper. Right now, you'd get a good sized plant that's probably been at the nursery for a while, so it's very well rooted if it's been well cared for, which mostly they have. Um, you know, Pick it up gently and see if it comes pop out of the can. It's dry. You don't want that. But if it's well rooted and established in its pot, it's a good time to get it. And a lot of times they go on sale pretty soon, right? September, October, November, excellent planting times, especially as we get deeper into the rainy season. Presumably we do. Um, it used to be like clockwork, right? They'd say, well, when the rains return, that was the typical phrase. Now we don't know if they're gonna, but once they do, you can pretty well count on the ground getting saturated by November at least. And the planting window goes all the way to the middle of December. So really, that's a great time to plant because uh, the top growth has stopped trying to do anything, and all the focus of that plant is hormonally on the roots. It's getting ready to get rooted, right? So when you unpot that plant, I always like soak them first. Dig your hole before you unpot them. Soak the hole, like pour it full of water and watch, does it perk? If it doesn't perk, you might want to bring some more soil in and make a raised bed so that there's some breathing going on there too. Because otherwise, in our clay soils, you're kind of making a bathtub in which to drown a plant, right? Like they like some water, but not that much water. They, they'll even sometimes take running water in the spring, like where there's a seep, but not all the time. That's not their preferred habitat. They do like wet feet, but they don't want to drown. So you want them to have enough air that they can breathe. And again, deep mulching is really helpful for them because it keeps the soil structure probing and happy, and it can get through the soil better when the soil's opened up a little bit for it. So
So the idea is dig and then really soak, make sure that it drains, that it perks, and then put the plant in there with some rich
you're not too rich. It's interesting. What they really want is the backfill with with some compost mixed in, um, because you don't want any of the fortified soils or anything like that. Because we're not trying to encourage anything but root growth, and roots don't necessarily are not that interested in the nitrogen that the leaves are interested in, right? They're looking more at the phosphorus. So what you want is a good soil that is drains appropriately, but not isn't sandy and dry, right? It's that perfect thing, the well-drained, loamy soil. Ha. But any soil that drains well enough and can be amended with compost is going to be just fine.
then you put wood chips on top.
Yeah, and I use, the medium ones, not big logs, right? But the little fine ones get in my gloves and they kill my hands and get in my socks and I hate them. So I use the medium ones. They're great. And that will protect them from drying out from wind, gives them a little bit of frost protection around the root zone too. And like I said, it's helping to open up that soil because now you have all the biota in the soil on your side because you've given them shelter. And so instead of having a dry, arid top soil, you now have a place where they can actually multiply. And that first inch above the soil is the happy zone for a lot of things.
Any advice about varieties or mixing?
Yeah, I mean, there's early, mid, and late, so you want to look for a range of those. Some of the extremely large ones do not really taste like much. So, taste testing through the summer is always a good idea. Uh, but if you've done that at all, or you've like go to the U-Picks and stuff and say, oh, these are really great. What are these? They'll tell you the name of it. But there's also, for people who don't have a lot of space, there's some really tasty patio blueberries that are bred to be on the small side that can be in a container for many years and be very fruitful. So the patio types are definitely worth looking into if you have a smaller yard or a patio, right? Because other blueberries, the bush blueberries that have to me, the best flavor are usually the big ones that can be 5 or 6 feet tall or even more, right? And they're big. So you have to have room for that and allow for it. Um, it's a sort of a trade-off they've done for many years. Like the ones that are called things like pink lemonade are kind of novelties. And to me, they don't taste like a blueberry. And it's like, if I wanted pink lemonade, I'd be drinking pink lemonade. I want to eat a blueberry. I want it to taste like a blueberry. So some of the smaller ones that taste like wild blueberries, those are the ones I really favor. Um, Also, some of the clues are going to be in things like if they're called Oregon something or Chehalis best, or, there's, if they have Washington or Oregon place names associated, they're probably going to do just fine here. One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit about planting too is like so we're getting on to the equinox next week, right? And that's one of the traditional times to plant garlic and onions for the fall and winter. And then you do it again at the winter solstice, or at least for the garlic. But right now, if you pick out some of the biggest, fattest garlic cloves in your kitchen, you can plant them. It's about as easy as it gets. Just stick them in 10 inches apart. Um, put a little Dr. Earth of that nice organic scratch in for fertilizer on top, and they should be great by Thanksgiving or the winter holidays. So that's an easy thing to kind of plug in. If you haven't planted things like kale or broccolini or the winter leeks and Brussels sprouts and stuff like that, look for starts because there's still starts around. It's way too late to be trying to do that from seed, but it's still fine to tuck that kind of stuff in as a start. Um, and again, I'd give them a little fertilizer to help them get it going. And the thing to really think about these days is rabbits, because they are so prolific and they will move right in and eat your lettuce and eat your starts overnight. So I'm telling people, if either they put them in a big container, tall container, because they're happy to reach up and nosh over the side of a container that's not tall enough, but a big one, they can't get to all that up. They can't get that high. Or containers that are on tables or something that can keep them out. And then you can get your winter veg in there. This still is a good time to do that because you'll notice we're still in the like 60s, maybe even touch 70 now and then. At night, it's still in the 50s. We haven't dipped down into the 40s much. So that's still good growing for a lot of the cool season vegetables. The hardy lettuces, like the Four Seasons lettuces or anything that has winter lettuce in its name, those are going to be good ones that often go straight through. The red romaines, fabulous in cool season, and they usually are just crisp and perfect. They like this temperature range.
So you had made a note about things that I got some tomatoes, but that may be now I'm looking at a lot of green tomatoes.
Yeah, that was a thing. A lot of people were saying, what is going on with my tomatoes, my beans, my squash, my this, my that? And it's like, well, the temperature has a lot to do with that. So if you recall, spring was kind of late. We had some very cold temperatures well into May and even into June. And then it got warm and it got pretty hot, right? We got into the 80s. We had a little heat bump, not bad, and so some of those things started growing. But one of the things about the beans was, so even beans that were planted, the soil was still cold, and they need soil that's about 55 degrees or they kind of rot. So a number of people lost their first batch of beans, planted again. The second batch didn't really pick up speed. If they were lucky, if it was in full sun and well drained, you might well have had a lot of beans. Some people did. But if it was half a day of sun, maybe the soil wasn't that great, you might just be starting to get the blossoms on the beans now, which doesn't mean write them off because you could still get beans in another month, right? Um, I never, that we used to call it the Indian summer. I don't know what they call it now, but the point is, it's this warmish extended autumn. You can get lots of things. Peas. I've done second crops of sweet peas and snow peas many times by sowing them around now, middle of September, and they'll be up and doing. And often might get those for the holidays. Even then, they kind of freeze out.
It really depends on what happens, and we've had a lot of variety in that.
We have. The other thing I kind of want to touch on is tidying for pollinators, because for many people learned that this is the time when you just rip everything out of the garden and then let it be fallow, which, is exhausting for the soil, which has given up everything to the plants, which are just ripped out. And so nothing is coming back to them. So remediating instead is definitely an important piece of that. But also remembering that a lot of the pollinators, especially many of our native bees, are ground dwellers. So you may have little hives of native bees all over your garden. They don't usually go much more than a few hundred yards in their life, right? They're pretty local. So rather than ripping everything out and cleaning it up, you might consider a couple different things. One I like to do is chop and drop, which is just chopping stuff up and letting it compost in sight, throwing some wood chips over the top of the whole thing and letting it be. That's a really good way to preserve the quality of the soil and make sure you haven't disturbed any of the pollinators. But the other thing to think about is when certain things, like if the kale is bolting or the lettuce is bolting and still putting out flowers like mine is, I leave those because there are still bees. Today at the center, when we were planting, we noticed bees on all kinds of things. And that's just a piece to remember, that they don't follow the calendar, they follow the temperature and the plants. And if, as long as there's still something blooming, you'll see somebody looking for it, right? Um, so that piece is important too, to not tidy too much too fast or too hard, right? And
You encouraged me to leave the lilacs after they had bloomed. I was always trying to clean up, make it look tidy, and of course, it's just as nice to sit and watch the birds working over the hummingbirds and everybody just kind of poking
yeah,
away at what's left.
right? They love those seeds. And that's the fun part too. The lettuce seeds will be eaten by birds. Sunflowers, if you leave them up, the whole seed core is going to disappear, which is really fun. They're being used, not just decorative. And I kind of love that part. And we're repaying our nature's debt a little bit by befriending a lot of these critters that really kind of rely on us to provide for them, because so much habitat has been lost. One of the things about the hummingbirds is that a lot of them have, especially the anise, have adapted to wintering over here, which means they're really very dependent on us unless we plant a number of things that will bloom through the winter. They do. They definitely like the Mahonias, the Oregon grapes family. That's a big one for them. And a lot of Oregon grapes bloom from now all the way through March. So having a variety of those, if you've got room for them, that's a great way to have color and fragrance and happy pollinators. Because a lot of the bees, for instance, will be awake when the temperature rises, which all through the winter fluctuations, it means we'll get a good warm day. And before too long, you've got some bees out there. Let it cool off at night, they'll go back and go dormant again. They're adaptive that way. But the other thing I like to plant a lot of is hardy fuchsias, because hummingbirds love those, and they're very high in nectar. So they get visited a lot. Um, I want to cycle back to the tomatoes though, because I kind of got off track there. That one of the things about the tomatoes is if they're still blooming, just cut all those blossoms off. They're not going anywhere now. And you want the plant to concentrate on ripening what's left. And if you do have a lot of green tomatoes and it looks like we're going to dip down, get really cold, you can harvest them, put them in a brown bag with a banana to get that ethanol effect. That's a ripening gas that comes naturally from bananas. Or you can, we've had a lot of little ones. I usually put them in an egg carton, one in each slot, because if you put them in a box, sometimes they get soggy on the bottom and kind of start rotting out. But if you put them in an egg carton, they got air all around them, and then they'll ripen really evenly and nicely. I personally pretty much grow mostly the cherry tomatoes anymore rather than try to get the big slicers because you just have no idea if it's going to be a big slicer kind of summer or not. But I'll say my sun gold has been incredibly productive. It's like that's my favorite of the little ones. That and the midnight snack, which is a black, um, beautiful black cherry, about so big, really tart, sweet balance is perfect.
And remind me about your idea of roasting some of those nearly ripe tomatoes.
Yeah, so that's a great way to do it. If you're not going to ripen 400 of them, which you might not want to, just use a rimmed baking sheet, put some olive oil, or I use avocado oil because it has a higher temperature, and just rub them slightly, and I put them skin side down. So you either cut them in half or quarters, depending on how big they are, and put them in at 225 for a couple hours if they're good size, and they can be lightly caramelized almost on the bottom. And then you just freeze the whole thing and add that to a sauce or a soup down the road, and it's delicious, right? Or you can puree it and make a kind of salsa, like throw in the last of the basil and a little pepper or two and some onion, and it makes a really delicious cooked salsa. Or you can poach fish in it, right? That's another yummy way to use that bounty. And green tomatoes, of course, you can slice them and fry them. That's a classic thing. Cornmeal. That extra fine grind cornmeal doesn't break your teeth, which is kind of good to know, right? And there's always green tomato chutney, which you would use a recipe that would work for apples or mango and use it with green tomatoes and a lot of ginger, again, onions and some golden raisins. Makes a really beautiful chutney too. Seems like there was another thing I was gonna.
Well, you want to talk about soil amendments, what to do maybe generally if we aren't, I mean, what other things to put, composting, leaves.
Oh,
You were
yeah.
talking earlier about just chop and drop. Um,
Yeah, so with chop and drop, you can do anything except if it's diseased. And one thing I'm seeing a lot of right now is powdery mildew, which looks sort of like silvery dust or flower dust on a lot of plants. So that's a dry root problem. And of course, yes, everybody's got dry roots if they haven't been irrigated all summer. So those I would put in the green waste rather than in trying to chop and drop in place. But if everything still looks healthy, but is just going over, like maybe you did get beans and you've harvested the rest of your beans and now you're just kind of looking at the rest of the bush or whatever, or you're gathering in all your big tomatoes and you're ready to call it, chop and drop those, that's fine. They'll just be great. Perennials too, perennials that are spent, take them all the way down, chop up all the bits and pieces and scatter them around because the nutrients stored in that plant is exactly what nature designed to feed it with. So you can take it away and make compost and bring it back, or you can also just kind of compost inside on site. Again, with a nice layer, I put real compost, like finished compost, over the whole thing, and then wood chips on top of that. Seal the deal, right? But
I,
if you're looking for amendments, another good one, I do often look for humic acid in pelletized form and on poor soils, soils that could use a little boost. Humic acid is not a nutrient as such, but it's a soil builder. So it builds, it's one of the components in compost, and it helps open soil and make it more arable, better at holding both water and air. So that's when I scatter and before I put the compost down and then top it off, right? Yeah.
and I've got some raspberries that, they bloom this year, they fruited, and then next year's plants, canes are coming up. So I'll just cut the ones that produce this year and just leave
Right.
them where they are.
Yeah. Just chopping
And
them all up.
and then put some more compost and chips. Try to keep those other grasses and stuff that grow up down a little bit.
Yeah.
Doesn't bother me too much though.
Well, grass is a pest. It's sort of funny that, people think all the things that might grow in the grass are the pests, but I'm thinking the grass itself is a pest personally. And trying to keep that out of the beds is a really good idea because the grasses tend to go out and send out little trailers and then pop up everywhere. It's kind of interesting. I've been growing sweetgrass in my pea patch, and it too is territorial and it really likes to spread out. And I've been harvesting it, and it's so delicious. As it dries, I have bundles of it in my laundry room, and it just smells like vanilla. But my cat was trying to chew on it, and I realized actually that could be fatal because the vanilla scent is caused by coumarin, which is a precursor to coumadin, the blood thinner. So we don't really want our animals chewing on sweetgrass. It's something to really, I hadn't really thought about that before, but now I'm like, oh yeah, maybe you don't want that in your garden exactly if you want to keep it somewhere that the pets can't get at it. Sure smells good though.
And I guess I don't know. I'm thinking that's kind of those are all the questions I have. Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap it up here?
I don't know, Barbara, do you have any more questions?
Is there a way to get the um buttercups out of the lawn?
So buttercups are another one. They do a different thing. They hop. They don't go underground as much. Each little clump has a circle of roots like a doily, right? And then they send out a runner like a strawberry and hop. And then they plant themselves and then they hop. And so hop, hop, hop. One of the best times to get rid of them is after a thaw in the winter. They're very bright green, so you can see them again. It's one of my winter warrior things. And there's little forks, the garden forks that have two tines, and you can just pop those whole things out. Um, which is great. And then you follow the string, right? Like pop beads, boom, 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 boom. That will do it. They're not that hard to get out if you just keep on it. But well, yeah, they get going and they don't slow down. They don't, mowing doesn't stop them. That's the thing, because they're kind of flat. So they're not going to be kept under control by mowing the way some of the cane thicketing things are.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that everything you have is a hand weeding thing, but Bainbridge Youth Services hires kids out.
Yep. They aren't hardy enough to last a day.
Oh, really?
Honest. We work really hard.
Yeah.
And they poop out. So it's not that we don't like them, it's that we wear them out.
They probably need to be fed more often than we do because they're still growing, right? Whereas,
Yep.
yeah, our growth is done. I don't know. Marcy, do you have anything?
She often listens to us like the radio.
Yeah, exactly. Burbling happily away in the background.
That's right.
Well,
I think it's been a wonderful session. I
Oh,
appreciate you doing
okay.
this.
Yes,
Oh, here she
yes, I
comes.
do have something. I'm sorry, I was dropping the thing. My question was about the Persicaria.
uh-huh.
I have a small garden. At the moment is alive. It's a pollinator paradise right now. And I wonder, when do I cut? I've never grown the Persicaria before. I don't know when I should cut it. How long do I have to wait to cut it down? Because
Well,
the bees just love it.
I know it's still blooming, so don't cut it until it stops blooming.
Yeah.
I wait until it really starts browning off.
Okay, so just wait it out. I just
Oh
didn't know
yeah.
if I should be doing something with it or not.
No, it's it's once you got it, you're gonna have it. It's the one
My
called Love.
problem. Yeah, that's what worries me.
Well, it doesn't have the space to run for you, but it's definitely going to be hardy. And the thing is, you just wait and let it bloom itself out. And when it stops flowering, that's when you can cut it all the way to the ground.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, I should mention too, we were talking about this today when we were gardening at the center.
Yeah.
So this is a really good time to trim back hardy herbs like lavender, where if it's starting to get big and flopsy, what you want to do is you cut it back, but not all the way to gray, because that old gray wood doesn't usually sprout back from that. But you'll look and see the fine green or silvery green or bluish green, the foliage. You can cut half of that, half the height of it off when you take off the suspended stems, and that will create a much bushier plant. And the earlier you do it in the plant's life, the bushier it will be. But even if you've waited a while and it's a big old hulking thing, it will still help. But if they get too big and sprawly, you might get to the point where you think maybe it's time to just yank it out and start again in the spring. That's what I would do. Rosemary, you can actually kind of almost not really shave it, but cut it back pretty hard, and it will come back well. But again, not all the way to the old wood, but you have to cut off some of the new stuff, and then it will bounce back and be much bushier that way. So that's what I've got.
Okay, well, that's good. Thank you very much, and we'll talk again. I appreciate you coming when you do, and sharing your wisdom with us.
Always fun. Thanks,
Good.
everybody.
Thank you.